Let's talk, though, to George Pascoe-Watson, Chairman at Portland Communications. We haven't spoken to you for a long time, George. How are you doing?
Mike, it's great to see you and great to be with your viewers and listeners this morning.
Absolutely right. Now, it's hard to know where to begin this morning because it's been one of those weird summers, which is sort of now, I suppose, coming to a close. You know, maybe finally the warm weather has passed away and we've got something more September-like today. We've got G20 summit talks going on. We've got Rishi Sunak being advised by Trevor Kavanagh this morning to get on with it and actually do something. We've got Keir Starmer still quite far ahead in the polls, but not so far that he's sitting pretty. Rishi Sunak's got a big week coming up, but at the moment all I can see that's on the table for the Conservative Party is banning XL bully dogs.
Yeah, I mean, listen, that's a serious story, of course, and I know we're going to come on and talk about it, but it has to be dealt with. And listen, Rishi Sunak is in one place right now. He's coming up maybe a year, maybe even less from a general election. He, of course, was not elected by the British public, and he holds that title as Prime Minister very, very dearly to himself. Now, he has got a very big challenge here. What he needs to do is put himself on the right side of common sense, so that the British people think he's doing the right thing on a whole range of issues that matter to the British people. So you will see him being what people will call populist in a whole bunch of areas, and to try and smoke out Labour on sensitive areas like cancel culture and other things, to try and put Labour in a very difficult position, try to get Labour and Keir Starmer to say, this is what I stand for as well, or this is what I don't stand for. Getting Labour smoked out on their issues right now is hugely important. There is a very, very big concern amongst a lot of people in the business sector that, a Labour government would keep the cards very close to their chest in the run-up to a general election, and then as soon as they get into power, might increase taxes and make things even more expensive than they are currently. So Rishi Sunak's big job, really, is to position himself on the right side of common sense. That said, Trevor Kavanagh, my old boss at The Sun, he's right. It's very important for this government to show that it's achieving outcomes, not just inputs, but outcomes. Your listeners, your viewers, what we want is to see real action on the areas that really matter. And perhaps there's no more important one, Mike, than to get the economy creaking into gear, to take advantage of the Brexit that we've got now and the independence and freedom to make our own rules, and to create real economic strength. That's the only way of us getting out of the terrible public expenditure problems that we've got in this country.
Yes, and there is this kind of general view that there's a malaise about the British economy, but there's a malaise about an awful lot of economies, aren't there, particularly in Europe. We've got Emmanuel Macron actually at the weekend recommending to people in France that what they should do if they want to make a decent investment in any country is to invest in Britain.
And he's right. And that's an amazing insight and fantastic to hear. And it is true that we have the opportunity to go far quicker than other countries now that we are free to make our own decisions by and by. We're not completely out of the European Union, but of course the EHRC means that there are still rules that we have to abide by, and actually changing rules that exist is going to take a long period of time. But by and large, he's right. Loads and loads of countries are struggling with this sort of very difficult inflation cycle that we've had, and nobody's really knocking it out of the park. Britain is doing much better, the official figures show us, than a lot of people would have us believe. But we still need a real engine powering away, which is not really fully pumping in this country. And that's what will generate the revenue, which will give us the world-class public services that we want. The answer is not throwing more good money after bad.
Yes, and I mean, we've got a long way to go to get world-class public service, it seems to me, because we've got the NHS waiting list problem, which grows every single week, it would seem. We've got a hell of a lot of problems in the NHS which need fixing, which I believe actually should be being fixed by the NHS, not necessarily just by government intervention, because the NHS has run itself into the ground rather than doing so without anybody else's help from the outside. We've got the border force that don't seem to know which way to point their boats. I mean, I was laughing at the weekend that if that guy Daniel Khalif had tried to escape to France on a boat, he would have been rescued by border force halfway there and brought back to Dover, you know, because that seems to be their main role in life. And the migrant problem is a massive problem for Rishi Sunak.
It's very, very big problem, partly because it's visible.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of things that we can't see and that happen the whole time around us that are invisible to us, unless you're in that organization. The NHS is another visible one, of course, because you can actually see queues. So anything that's visible is embarrassing for the Prime Minister. He's made one of his 5 pledges to stop the boats. It's a difficult phrase because to most of us, it means we won't see any boats coming over. And of course, that's not happening. And there's no measure that they can take. The truth of the matter is that the immigration situation is almost beyond redemption. I think people in the Home Office, if they had a really candid conversation with you, would tell you that all we're doing really is doing high-profile activity to try and show that we're actually tackling the problem. But it's a problem which is enormous. It's global. We're not the only country dealing with this. The French have huge numbers of immigrants coming in seeking asylum, and many of them, of course, end up coming to our shores. But it is a global problem. It's not going to be dealt with easily. And, of course, that is visible, and it remains a vulnerability for Rishi Sunak and his government.
I mean, there was one interesting story at the weekend that I sort of latched onto in the Sunday Times, I think it was, where 2 illegal migrants have actually been sent to prison in this country because they got into a fight with the gendarmerie in France before they got on a dinghy. And so when they arrived in the UK, they were arrested immediately, not because of their fight with the gendarmerie, but they've actually been convicted for trying to enter Britain illegally, which tells me that, well, if you can do it with them, surely you can do it with an awful lot of them.
Well, indeed, and a lot of people take the same view. What is the problem with that? There's a great example of the law taking its course. There are laws in place to make that happen, and people are being prosecuted, and successfully. So that's, I think, where people are hoping that the prosecuting authorities will start taking their action. You know, I think it's hard for all the people who are genuinely out there trying to do their job, the police, the border force. Not everybody there is doing the best job they possibly can, but a lot of them are. They're working very, very hard on an extremely difficult problem, and it's hard. And I think that this is a problem of our age, and nobody really has the solution.
No, they don't yet, but we're going to have to find one pretty soon if Rishi Sunak wants to win the next election. In fact, if he did find one, it probably would win him the next election, because I don't think Labour have got any ideas on that front particularly at all. Let's talk about China, because front page of the Times this morning revealed the spy suspect at the heart of power, a 28-year-old young man called Chris Cash, who was working for the chairwoman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I mean, you work in and around Westminster a lot, George. You must come up against some interesting characters from time to time. I mean, is there a sort of what can only be described as a network of people for whom people like yourself would be wise to avoid seeing?
Well, there's no doubt that Britain has, for a long time, actually been a magnet for foreign interests to come here to do light espionage, obviously some more sinister than that. And I think the Houses of Parliament in general are a place, and Whitehall, which attracts those type of agents. A lot of it is just low-level intelligence gathering. It's telling their home countries or the countries that they support who's doing what job, what sort of a person they are, how might you influence them. And that's to be expected. And I think, you know, it's very important for parliamentary authorities, for members of parliament, to just be on their guard. And most of them are, to be honest. And I think that there's a difference between the sinister and the low level, but it's still very, very important to be aware that this is happening the whole time. One of the strengths of having a great free country, Mike, is that we also do allow foreign students and others to come to this country. You only have to look at our universities. The university staff now, right across the estate in the UK, is full of experts from other parts of the world, some of them Chinese, some of them from other countries where we might feel ourselves a little bit uncomfortable. Now, the upside is that brings international knowledge, but the downside is, of course, it makes us vulnerable. And I'm not saying that they are all espionage fiends, not at all. But we have to bear in mind that a country as open as Britain does have a whole bunch of people here whose number one concern may not be Britain's successful future. And some of them are sinister, most of them are not. But it's part and parcel of our modern place in the world.
There's no question that China has certainly got its hooks into an awful lot of big universities, a lot of the Russell Group universities, particularly in Oxford and Cambridge. They've got chairs that they've sponsored, they've got entire departments that they bankroll, and of course it's money for the universities. But at the same time, I'm not sure quite how closely all of those institutions are being monitored in terms of what they're actually doing and who is doing it.
And that's always the challenge, Mike. You know, do we say no and close our borders and shut our door to the rest of the world? No, we can't do that. Why? Because we depend on our international position in the world for our wealth and our revenue generation. And I think it's a healthy thing to do. Not everybody would agree with me, and that's a perfectly fair and legitimate opposition. But that's my view. The reality is there are lots and lots of universities who need the money from foreign students. That's a critical thing, since we don't want taxpayers to pay for students anymore, and that's also an important point to bear in mind. We have to have the up and the down that goes with it. Keeping a monitor on it is very important, and I will say this, and I'm sure you'll know what I mean, Mike, that sometimes it's quite useful for our security and intelligence services to have these relationships and to be aware of what perhaps low-level spies are saying about us, because it helps us understand how we're being seen in other parts of the world. So it's quite a complex and sophisticated operation that we're talking about here. We don't want to close our door to everybody, because actually knowing what they're saying about us can be quite helpful.
Interesting. Stay with us if you would, George, because we're going to talk about the devil dogs. We're going to talk about the possibility of a cabinet minister, the Home Office no less, the Home Secretary wanting to ban dangerous dogs, to wit, XL bully dogs, one of which was responsible for the most horrific attack over the weekend.